Hey Kevin, how's it going?
Oh, I'm doing great. Thank you. How are you?
Very good. Glad that you're back here with me on this Sunday to, through Zoom, to the power of technology to discuss yet again eternal conscious torment. And we're finally getting down to brass tacks here. An actual description of the burning flesh for all of eternity. Just kidding. It was supposed to be funny, but anyway,
Okay.
that's not what Bart Ehrman wrote
No,
about.
no.
So that's not what
Despite
we're
our provocative
discussing.
title, right? Yeah.
Quite our yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Some people have already thought that we were promoting the doctrine of eternal conscious torment,
No.
which we are doing the opposite.
Right.
But it's actually not funny, as we talked about in the last
No.
podcast. It's had very deleterious effects, not only on us, and we gave some examples, but also just I think in society and humankind in general. If anything comes from hell, it's the doctrine of eternal conscious torment. So that's how I that's how I
Yeah.
think about it. It is not of the God of love.
Yeah. And if
But
you actually look at, I appreciate the book, just, getting into the history of it and how it developed and just reading through the Bible. It's like, wow, we really create our society has created a view of hell that's totally not biblical.
yeah,
It's so clear to me now, that's like, wow, so many people believe in this and can be quite traumatic and it bears bad fruit, in my opinion.
cut it down.
Yeah, yeah.
It bears
So
bad
yeah, I was
fruit.
born and I
Uproot it.
went to our Mennonite church in Columbus.
Yeah, cool.
It was it was I don't know what they called it, um, but this church they make quilts uh, throughout the year to give to people in need,
I've
like
heard it called
certain.
quilt ministry before. I don't know.
Yeah,
Maybe
yeah,
that's what it
yeah.
is.
They call themselves peacemakers,
Yeah,
and
nice.
Piece. I think peacemakers.
Yeah.
I think. And so I actually attended it. I attended one. It was kind of a church wide thing in the evening on a Friday where we kind of knotted the little pieces together. Anyway, it's so that yeah, we just knotted it together, and I did that maybe in February, and then this past Friday I went to a peacemakers meeting, worked on some quilts, so that was fun. But this Sunday was like basically where the church blesses the quilts, before it sends off to people that need
Yeah.
them,
Very
and it
nice.
was kind of neat. It's like 270 quilts they made,
Oh
and
wow.
it was just kind of nicely folded over the pews, and so it
Beautiful.
was kind of pretty colorful. And then there was also a baptism and
Hmm.
communion. So, and the gentleman that was baptized, I don't know how old he was, but 70s, 80s maybe, and he grew up Jewish, kind of more of a secular, like a non-practicing Jew, and became agnostic or atheist just 2 years ago. You'd probably call
Hmm.
himself an atheist. And then he just started kind of reading some things on, I guess, philosophy and Buddhism um, and mysticism and things like that, and just started going to the Mennonite church and got into Richard Rohr. They
Oh,
have
cool.
like
Hmm.
a little book study of Richard Rohr books, I guess.
Oh,
and
nice.
yeah, and
Good
so and
choice.
then he was baptized. He was just decided to choose to follow Christ and be part of the Mennonite community. So it was a
Nice.
neat story.
That is neat.
And
Did he get to
yeah.
tell it or like in front
Oh
of the church
yeah,
or? Oh, cool. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. He had an opportunity to kind of share a lot. Again, he's like in his 70s or 80s. He's a widower, um, but uh, but yeah, it was neat. And that's one thing I like. I'm used to a church where like you do a little singing or a lot of singing and maybe like some announcements, and then you have the pastor come up and speak for 30, 40 minutes. But at the Mennonite church, it's not like that. I mean, you have things like singing, and you have response readings, and you have times of silence, and um, then you have like maybe a 15, 20-minute sermon. Then you kind of have announcements. Then you might have like kind of a time when you share any prayer requests or things like that in front of the church. And so it's kind of it's somewhat structured, but not too structured. They won't get mad if you mess up, I guess is what I'm saying. It's kind of a nice little community celebration every week.
Yeah, yeah. They don't get mad if you mess up. I like that.
Yeah.
But
I just
forgiving, because that's
I
how you're
just remember,
supposed to be as a community of
yeah,
believers, forgiving, loving.
right. And I remember when I was Catholic. I mean, I appreciate that upbringing, but I always felt like nervous, just messing up
Yeah.
or kind of
There's
thing.
a kind of scrupulosity that's imbued in worshipers, or I mean, in the congregation and laity at any rate, where there's this kind of like, yeah, there's all kinds of ways to screw things up and do it wrong. The
Yeah.
most devastating stories that I do remember, we were talking before about how, one of the biggest reasons why we're doing this is so that, our children and maybe their children who are interested in who we were and what we thought, have something to look at. And it really does come from the idea that like I want to hear what I remember conversations about from my
Mhm.
grandparents and religious conversations. And I was in some ways lucky to grow up in a house that thought about those kind of things. I mean, unfortunately, I don't think I would agree with a whole lot of the way they thought about those kind of
Mhm.
things, because a lot of it was this, as you say, this fear of screwing up. And
Mhm.
that was a kind of scrupulosity that I internalized and have fought against my whole life. This, what they call basic shame, this sense of, having screwed up and like, always trying to figure out how. But the story that I would share, it was one of the ones I overheard from my grandpa, who I actually, sort of a terrifying story in a way, but he told me that he was talking about just like the holiness of, or the sacrality or something of the Eucharist, and he was just saying this was supposed to be a lesson to me about how seriously you were supposed to take it. But he said, he caddied, and that was like the way he worked, his depression and all this other kind of stuff. And he worked all day long caddying, for the rich folk and whatever. But like, and he said that one day after caddying, he didn't have time to stop at home and change, and so he just went to mass. And when he came up time to receive the communion, he had on I guess like a golf shirt, he called it, but a polo basically. And the priest refused him communion. Told him,
Oh,
you're not, dressed appropriately to, meet
yeah.
meet the Lord or whatever, or consume the body of Christ. And he just
Yeah.
told me that story with deep shame, like, just like, but as a lesson to me, like, like, I guess mostly like, look, like, this is serious, take it serious. Like, there's all kinds of, it really communicated to me his sense that there's just all kinds of ways to screw up. And then, one like particularly traumatic time, and this one is even more serious. I remember being in front of a grave, and it was somebody that I didn't know. At this time, like, I remember going with like grandparents and stuff. I don't remember which day it was. Maybe it was All Saints Day, the day after Halloween, and you go clean off the graves of relatives or whatever. This was a relative I had never seen before, and it was an infant. That was the other thing I noticed. And he said to me and my family, like, I killed this child. And we were just all like, "Oh my God!" And he said, "Yeah, I was sick, and my parents told me not to pick the baby up, but the baby was so cute, and I picked the baby up anyways. And then, gave the baby whatever flu I had and or cold, and killed the child." My
Yeah.
grandfather actually, believed that. You know what I mean? Like, maybe somebody had told it to him, but like, this is the kind of way in which, when you're raised with this idea that there's so many possibilities for doing something
Yeah.
wrong, and transgression has this tremendous set of consequences that come along with it, is punishment. And this is like so tied together to me with the idea of, you know, being saved, salvation, and all the different ways you can screw that up. And it sounds like at your church, and I don't want to project too much into it, but at least the baptism you described today, it's there's a way in which we can go back to me a more John the Baptist sense of
Yeah.
baptism, rather than a baptism in order to save you from eternal conscious torment or whatever.
Right. Yeah.
Because I mean, the thing about Calvin, I mean, he's just adumbrating, Paul in some ways. But like, just I had a professor once, I think, taught me History of Christian Thought 3. Yeah, that's right. She said Calvin took his theology straight, no chaser. And he did. He said, like, look, if there are people that are, predestined or saved by their baptism, and that kind of a idea of salvation as a ticket to eternity, or however you want to put that, then there are people who are also, damned. If there are chosen, the term itself means that there are people who are not chosen.
Hmm.
And so, you just kind of wonder if followers of the way with John, and so we talk a lot about this as we transition from uh, the Hebrew scriptures into the New Testament today, that you wonder what John's innovation actually was. Was he preaching salvation from eternal conscious torment? We're really sure that he wasn't. So like, and
Hmm.
that's covered to some degree here. One of Ehrman's, I guess, associates, they seem to be friends, like they've been on each other's podcasts and stuff, is this scholar who I've always loved. I think he taught at North Carolina, if I'm not mistaken, James Tabor. And he's done a lot of work on like that John the Baptist community, which for him included Jesus, and included Mary and Mary Magdalene, and included Peter,
Hmm.
kind of as in his way of thinking about it, not exactly opposed to Paul, but at least not into that Pauline, or what became of Paul's doctrine of, like, baptism, not for the forgiveness of sins, just as because there's an extra step involved there. That does seem to be what John the Baptist was preaching. It does seem to be what Jesus was preaching about baptism as well. There's a lot of speculation as to whether he was a follower of John, or I don't know,
Hmm.
originators of this, but most scholars think it was John who kind of was like doing this new thing with baptism, because before that it had largely been not so much for the forgiveness of sins in like a moral sense, but it had been like for ritual purity. And you see that at Qumran especially,
Hmm.
that kind of notion. And the way scholars kind of put it together is that they think that um, perhaps John was either aware of the community Qumran, or came out of it, like broke from it on certain things around ritual purity, and then opened up baptism, not for like a holy kind of a priestly existence, but opened it up more sort of democratically for everybody. And also seemed to make it a little bit more, I don't know, based on, morality rather than ritual purity.
Yeah. Wasn't it like
The,
it's a baptism of repentance? Is
right.
that?
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's how I understand it at any rate.
Yeah.
So and so that teaching to me, so you kind of wonder, um, is there a way to separate it out from eternal conscious torment altogether, so that you're not transacting for, the afterlife with God in baptism, and that you're also not, I don't know. It's more for like salvation now, and I mean afterlife may follow or whatever. But the point is like, not to proclaim yourself as marked separate or different from other people necessarily, so much as declaring some sort of freedom from your sinful
Yeah,
nature or whatever, or something like that. That
yeah,
doesn't require there to be some people who are in and some people who are out. Now that might not be possible. So
yeah. I know. I
I
know.
don't know.
What I witnessed this morning, it was more of just recognizing the brokenness of the world and the brokenness of ourselves, and deciding to embody Christ and um, pursuing justice, and you know,
Right.
and loving people, and as well as just to become part of a community um, too. So
Yeah,
that was
is it
kind
possible to
of
return baptism to that? I guess is sort of my question. Like
um,
that, and I think it's sort of what informs a little bit of how I think about our conversation today. Because that's my hope, at any rate, that baptism could again be like it sounds like it is at your church, just this pure celebration of God's love and
yeah,
radical, acceptance and,
right,
solidarity and human suffering and all that kind of stuff,
yeah, yeah,
rather than this like I'm going to heaven and you and
yeah,
anybody who doesn't do this is going to burn for all of eternity or whatever.
right. That definitely wasn't what I witnessed. Yeah, it was.
Yeah, yeah,
It's
very
very
nice.
interesting. I'm learning a lot. Just it's you can't. You can read about the Mennonite history.
Hmm.
It doesn't really help in understanding what this particular church, as well as their denomination that they kind of belong to, it doesn't really help describe what this church is. It's a
Hmm.
very much inclusive, and just people just tell me like we accept everyone
Yeah, yeah.
basically. Like, I mean, the pastor basically said, this one gentleman is a Jewish Buddhist Christian or something like
Yeah,
that. Like,
yeah.
because he has a
Huh.
lot of probably some Buddhist teaching that he holds to as well,
Yeah.
and as well as he's pretty intelligent. This church is in their campus, so I'm meeting so many people that are, were, oh, I started going to this church when I was pursuing my PhD at Ohio State, and you know, and they're very academic. A lot of people there are, and and just yeah. So he was like, and he has his field of study was psychology, and so kind of he implements some things like seeing the world scientifically as well, and being a Christian. Yeah, so they're very open to. I think just like I said, I think before there's no like statement of faith that they have listed. It's more of like, are you gonna join the community, enter into like where you are, and being embodying Christ in your community, and um, so yeah, it's learning a
Yeah, well,
lot.
as we'll see today, and as James Tabor pointed out, and also as Ehrman points out in the book, but I've watched a lot of and read a lot of Tabor before, and he says like, what happens when Jesus is asked point blank, "What do I have to do to enter the
Yeah,
kingdom?" He does not say anything about even baptism. He doesn't say
no,
anything about. You need to believe these four things, do these four things, or whatever, give your life to me, or whatever, in this way. Doesn't say any of that. He says something way more difficult, but I do think it requires some
it's
interpretation.
it's funny when I became a evangelical Bible believing Christian in college. I think it was my freshman year, second semester. I said I'm going to read the Gospels, just Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. You know, and I remember reading it. And my roommate grew up in a Bible oriented church, and so and I remember reading just every night. I read a certain section of or a certain amount of the New Testament of the Gospels, and and I remember observing some things just with my first reading. One thing I observed is that the gospel writers were just repeating the same story over and over. I thought that was interesting. Um, and I also discovered, wait a
Except for
second, Jesus.
John.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Except for
Sorry.
John. Yeah, I did notice it was a little
Everybody
different.
else
Yeah,
had variations, but John
right.
went
But some of the
totally
stories
different.
do overlap,
Jesus,
but
pretty much. But yeah, yeah,
the resurrection and the death is all there. But
yeah.
um, And then I started reading. I'm like, oh wait, Jesus had brothers and sisters.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
I remember saying that to my roommate, who, like I said, grew up he grew up Plymouth Brethren, but kind of more evangelical, and but his parents were Catholic, so I think he kind of like had a mixture of exposure, I guess. His parents, yeah, grew up Catholic, and so and I said that I said, and he didn't believe me. He didn't believe me. Like, no, it says right here, Jesus had brothers and sisters. And so it's like, oh, okay. Well, he never saw that before. But then I read where Jesus, I'm not quite sure where, but Jesus sent his disciples to preach the gospel. And I said, I was like, wait a second, Jesus hasn't died yet. He hasn't hasn't risen from the dead. What are these? What are his disciples preaching? Preaching the gospel. Wait, the gospel isn't like revealed yet, you know. And anyways, I just remember that, and
Yeah, believing in
yeah,
the
as
death and
well as certain
resurrection didn't
verses
seem
that
to be
say,
a part of that gospel.
yeah, I was like, what, it is about the kingdom of God and what
Yeah,
that
right.
means for
That's right.
the right now.
That's
I
right.
didn't
Yeah.
realize that. And even like verses like every knee will bow. I'm like, every knee will bow.
Yeah, right.
So I had a little universalist kind of inside of my head. And I remember I mentioned that at a campfire or something. It was at a retreat. And I
Yeah.
mentioned that a couple
Sure, that
people, and
wasn't
they were
greatly
like,
well received or whatever.
no, I mean, they're gracious about it,
Yeah.
because I was new. I was a new believer. And, um, but yeah, anyways, I just remember it's, you can never go back to like, the first time you do something, the first time I read the Gospels. You can only do it one time, and it's just fun to have your observations the first time you read through it.
Yeah.
Sometimes you can kind of you lose that. I think even if you read it over and over, sometimes you're so indoctrinated where maybe you don't see certain things as easily. Yeah.
Yeah. So you see, like, I'm getting this a bit from James Tabor, who I don't know if this is widespread. Does everybody call like, I get the Ebionites, it's a Greek term that means like renouncers of the world. So, like, yeah, that would include John the Baptist, Jesus, Peter, the brother of Jesus, James, Mary Magdalene, and Mary. I don't know how widespread that term is, but it's a term he uses often. Anyways, so those are the Ebionites or whatever. So it's kind of like, from what we can piece together, John is preaching, as an Ebionite, the preacher of the way. So he seems like he already has the gospel in some
Oh,
way,
yeah.
which is, as we said, repent and like renounce. I don't.
And
It's difficult to know. Does he mean like, renounce like me and wear sackcloth and eat locusts in the wilderness, like get
right.
put to death by Herod and all the rest of that kind of stuff? It's like, what is the way? What is the message at that point? And so then he's killed, and then Jesus has to carry that message forth, and it seems to involve some apocalypticism, some reinterpretation of that, some reinterpretations of the teachings of the Pharisees, and the keeping of the law, but very clear that the law is to be kept with your heart, which was the law of love, so that no particular law was above that greater law of love. Seems to be that because again, when he's asked, by the Pharisees, which is the most important commandment, says love God. That's it. And then if basically, if you understand what that means, it means love each other, love your neighbor. And then if you understand what that means, it includes your enemy. So that's pretty rough one.
Yeah.
And so, like, when asked point blank about these things, which is so shocking, he just does not articulate the theology that the four laws or whatever. He
No.
doesn't say to do any of those things, um which they're all fine to do. I'm not saying it's like anti-Christ to like do those things necessarily in a certain spirit, but to do it in the spirit of transacting some some
Yeah.
economic, value for your afterlife with God, that's definitely something he was preaching
And
against.
then and even when Jesus was asked, "Well, who's my neighbor?" He used a Samaritan,
Hmm.
where Jews and Samaritans weren't really friends, right?
Right.
And
Yeah, because
use the
Samaritans were
Samaritan
basically
as
screwed up
the
Jews to them.
example. Yeah, the example of like what it means to treat your neighbor, made a
Mhm.
Samaritan the hero in that parable.
And did
And
not try to convert the Samaritan either to
right,
the way that he was preaching, nor to like
yeah,
proper Judaism as Jews in the Southern Kingdom thought of
and
themselves.
that was one thing that like I just remember back when I read through the Gospels the first time, and then kind of comparing it to the four spiritual laws. And it just seems like Jesus was not passionate about getting people saved from hell. You know what I mean? It was he asked a lot of questions, told a lot of stories to get people to think. Um, Ran away or just walked away when there were big crowds. You know, he didn't seem that concerned about people's eternal destinies. I don't think he was more concerned about the life they were living, and specifically the religious leaders who were oppressing the normal people, so to
Yeah.
speak.
So either Jesus went through some shift, or the writers who were writing about him went through a little bit of a shift. But there's a shift between what Jesus seemed to be talking about with the kingdom is coming now, which was seemed to be a main part of his message at one point. Like, I mean, not now, but soon, like before this generation passes away.
Right.
And then, like, maybe he realized it or they didn't realize it, but or his disciples realized it or something, or the people who were writing about him realized it, but that wasn't happening in that way. So like there's this great scene where there's a temptation in the desert, and who knows how that. My dad once asked me, "Look, who was there with Jesus to get this story from him?" I'm like, I don't know. Maybe he told it to somebody, or maybe, and then that got passed down. Maybe a writer put this in the voice of Jesus because it was in line with what had been revealed to him about Jesus and in line with his
It
theology.
was a great picture of the 40 days of Moses and on Mount Sinai, and
Yeah.
you know, kind of yeah.
And also Jesus's total reinterpretation of his mission. So that even though it starts at the beginning of his ministry, but who knows what order it all happened in? Because
Right.
after he's baptized by John, he goes out into the desert, in some gospels, and in the desert, the main temptation really is, and it's the last one. It's just like take power and come in
Yeah.
power and like rule. Like you're a just guy, so obviously you can set things right. But he refuses to do it via power.
Yeah.
And so it's this reinterpretation of what messiahship is, as they all which was a part of what was already going on. So the Pharisees, who are portrayed as the enemies in the New Testament, because they were, by the time the New Testament was written, the Gospels, the Pharisees, pardon me, were already persecuting Christians. But at the time, there were plenty of Pharisees, like the one I always bring up is because it's easy, is Rabbi Hillel, who was already talking about loving, your neighbors and all that, and interpreting the law according to the law of love. So like that was Jesus kind of like seemed as hooked into that, or been hooked into that by somebody who wrote about it. It's difficult to know. But anyways, and then he now is reinterpreted. John reinterpreted. I'm having problems. John
Mhm.
reinterpreted baptism to be this, not this thing of ritual purity, but this more open thing for everybody. For the forgiveness of sins, and freedom from, yeah, those kind of things in the world. And then Jesus seems to have interpreted in the desert, however that happened, whoever wrote it, whatever. He reinterprets what messiahship means. So, like, anybody will tell you that the Messiah was to come in power as a ruler and reestablish the
Yeah.
kingdom of Israel. And that's Jesus either realized that that's not what he was going to do, or and it's kind of an interesting way too, in which Satan, as a accuser, tester, tempter, prosecuting attorney, actually serves the law, serves the purpose of a test, which is to clarify what's going on to Jesus himself, almost, so that he passes the test by not taking it in some ways, by not taking the bait. And so but he clarifies to himself, like, I'm not that kind of a Messiah. So I'm the one who comes in weakness, and meekness, however you want to put it. And so, like, my gospel is not the gospel of power and authority over the kingdoms of this world. But I preach the coming of the kingdom of love, which is throughout this, and this is a good example of how we've had to reinterpret things. So Jesus, it seems to be wrong at first when he starts talking about, this generation will pass away, won't pass away before you see me coming in glory to establish my kingdom or whatever, to like passages like, for example, towards the end of Luke, where you see the kingdom of God is within. Don't ask me when it's coming. Don't listen to people who say it's here or there, because it's going to come like a thief in a knife, thief in the night. That kind of a thing seems like you could either just say he was wrong and then he had to like scramble to get something else, or you could say, like, I think, like, yeah, sure, he misunderstood because he was, in the form of a servant, as Philippians said, and he didn't have omniscience. So he's like having to do what human beings have to do, which is figure things out on their feet as they go along
Yeah.
and reinterpret things
Yeah.
as they go along. This is what it means to be a human being, to not have foreknowledge, to not have a guarantee for how things are going to turn out, so that you can get a Christ on the cross saying, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Which doesn't seem to be able to see what this as a transaction
Right.
of, like, I do this
I
for
think you
that.
see it. I think it's in Luke, like between when Jesus was in the temple asking questions and his parents were mad at him, you know, for
As a 12
disappearing
year old, yeah, yeah.
12-year old. But then, like between 12 years old and when he started his ministry, kind of like he grew in favor of men and grew in wisdom, and kind of just the idea that he wasn't like omniscient and knew everything about what his purpose was at age 12. He kind of grew in that, I guess.
And that's what it means for God to empty himself of his
Right.
omnipotence, and to enter into the form of a servant or of a human.
Yeah.
And that is so,
Which has
I
to be
mean,
totally vulnerable, like,
yeah.
because like, if he's approaching the cross, I always say, well, is that a purely what's that word, altruistic attitude,
Mhm.
or was it? But did he know that he was going to rise from the dead? Like he didn't,
Right. Well, he
like,
clearly didn't when he said, "Why have you forsaken me?"
yeah.
That
So
would
he
that would
didn't
mean
quite
like this
know
was all for nothing. Yeah.
what was going to happen. Of course, then he
Yeah.
did refer that the Son of Man would rise in 3 days. He did. Of course, that could have been inserted by one of the authors too. So there seems to be kind of some sort of, what do you call it? Kenosis? Is that the emptying of
Yeah.
Christ
Yeah.
into?
Kenosis, the self-emptying of God. Yeah.
Yeah.
Into the form of a person.
So there seems to be a sense that he didn't know what awaited him. Um, I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I
That's
mean, and clearly in the Gospels where he said, the two of them, right now, I know, where he says, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Isn't that in Mark and Luke, maybe? But anyways, and then the other two Gospels, he doesn't say that. In John, he just says it's accomplished or whatever, famously because John has a very elevated Christology, so
right.
that you get this, like, no big sweat. I did what I was supposed to do. And you're
Yeah.
certainly not going to get a scene, in John where it's like, if it's possible, take this cup from me. Like, I don't want it. I don't want to do
Yeah.
this or whatever, which is this
Right.
very human moment. Like, John
Right.
seems to have a concern, not, just to be clear, not whoever wrote the Gospel of John. seems
Yeah.
to be concerned because it's the latest of the Gospels that you have a higher notion of Jesus as, human for sure, but God. So actually
Hmm.
suffering, but also God. And so, but it does bring up this problem that's been a problem. So, like, if you already know how it's going to turn out, then, like, that makes things a lot easier. Like, there's a lot of
Right.
martyrs that Bart Ehrman talks about in, in the book. I think it was it Ignatius, second century martyr, who says, like, yeah, this suffering now is just for an hour, but I'm going to be like vindicated or whatever. Just so much
Yeah.
about where internal conscious torment just creeps in, and my enemies are going to be suffering for all.
Right.
I'm going to be, in bliss for all of eternity, but the rest of them, they're going to be suffering for all of eternity.
Right.
And so that's not what Jesus says on the cross, because I think it's Matthew where he says, "Forgive them, for they don't know what they do." So he
Right.
doesn't. He does not say all these
No.
schmucks who did this to me are
Yeah.
gonna pay. He doesn't, like, so, like, he's not interested in vengeance in that regard at all.
And how
Um,
powerful is that? Like, to forgive, he forgave his enemies. And is God the Father not going to answer his son's God the Son's prayer?
mhm.
Um, Also, like when it comes to loving your enemies, the idea of eternal conscious torment, being God's enemies are in hell. Well, is God loving his enemies when he
Yeah,
allows that to happen?
yeah.
I
We
mean,
can back
that's
up
a,
just a little bit and talk about
yeah,
Maccabees, I guess. Just 'cause, so, like, he Ehrman, before he gets into all the stuff we're talking about right now, which is
yeah.
gospel stuff, he talks about what did people at the time think about the afterlife, I guess. And so he looks at Maccabees first of all, and second
So
Maccabees.
Maccabees being the interim period between the Old Testament and the New Testament, kind of 200 years
Yeah,
before Christ.
yeah, and this
Around
was even before the Roman occupation.
Yeah.
This is under the Sadducees in particular. There was a persecution under one of the leaders. Not sorry, not under the Sadducees. I meant to say in the well, whatever that satrapy is called there, and all of a sudden I'm forgetting it. But Antiochus, Greek general basically, who was the head of that satrapy there, Syrian satrapy basically, and he, decided to try to blot out Judaism basically,
Mhm.
and so this created a lot of Jewish martyrs. And in Maccabees, you see what to me is not like supposed to be a development of theology or anything like that, but it's like it does show you, like, maybe what people thought, in particular people who were being persecuted. So two things happened because of this persecution. One is apocalypticism, which had a little bit of root in Judaism, especially from the Babylonian captivity. So this comes up anytime that Israel or is I don't know, taken over. You start to get
Right.
this apocalyptic kind of preaching or whatever, including in the prophets and obviously Daniel and Ezekiel and stuff like that. So you get that kind of a theology where, like, the savior or the Messiah is going to come in glory and kick these guys' butts, and we're going to be vindicated and they're going to suffer or whatever. It's really difficult to get like a super developed theology about the afterlife from that, though. But
Hmm.
you can see the impetus to want to see your enemies punished, which we talked about before, that starts to develop during a persecution. And the persecutions are truly awful.
Right.
So, so there's no question about that. And also, as with most religious persecutions, it just, like, makes the religion more defined and more resistant to,
Hmm.
to the persecution in a way, because, like, you bar something and it becomes all that more strong in some kind of ways. Um,
Hmm.
So, but Fourth Maccabees written like after that. Fourth Maccabees seems to have been written. He mentions Ehrman mentions during the Roman occupation when the Romans came in, and it had a very similar kind of a flavor, except that it really developed like afterlife torment for oppressors. And that at that time it would have been a reviving of apocalypticism, a reviving of punishment being meted out towards the oppressors because of a Roman occupation now. So this would be more of what, closer, still before, but more closer to,
So the
Jesus's
first
time
two
or
books
whatever.
had to do with more of a Greek occupation.
One and two, yeah.
Yeah,
I
and
don't
then
know
four
anything
is
about
later
three.
on.
I just know that Ehrman
Yeah,
talked about four. So I don't know
yeah.
what three
Then
was.
four is more of a Roman occupation. Yeah, and then
Uh, yeah.
they and developing the idea of their persecutors. There's got to be. It's not just annihilationism that they're going to
Yeah.
have to suffer because how we have suffered as a people, and our suffering is not going to go in is not in vain. That we're going to
Yeah.
be in a total bliss, which is so makes sense to me. Like as human nature, like you see so many good people that may suffer or struggle. You kind of want them to have a little more out in the afterlife, and then you
Yeah.
have wicked people that prosper. You kind of don't want them just to not exist. You kind of want some justice.
Yeah.
It makes sense.
And then there was another text that he talks about in that chapter. All of a sudden, I'm forgetting the name. I know it had Abraham in the title. It's about Abraham, supposedly. And
Yeah, I think it's called
it was
Abraham. I
called the
think it
what?
is the Testament of Abraham.
Oh, that's it. That's easy.
What I have.
But I forgot it. Yeah, this is called the Testament of Abraham, which I wasn't really familiar with at all until Ehrman. I was familiar a bit with Maccabees, and also I guess he talks about Enoch a bit in this chapter too, which are apocryphal books or whatever. But there's a long story with Enoch. It's become one of these big, interesting things to study recently because there's been more and more revealed about the theology of the ancient Near East at that time. But the Abraham thing, what seems to be mostly established there is this idea of like a tour of like what heaven's going to be like. And there's a couple other ones like that. There's entering the throne room, I guess, but
Mhm.
in Daniel, but like there's not it's all very like abstract, and it's not very developed. The one main addition that you get in this Testament of Abraham book is you get like one of the joys, and this is I guess maybe the first time it's mentioned, because boy does this become a popular idea. One of the cool things about the afterlife for the righteous is you get to watch the people who tortured you get tortured. So,
Mhm.
you get this. And actually, Ehrman mentioned, which I thought was interesting too, that Dante. No, I'm sorry. Dante was influenced by a different book, not by this one. Maybe through time he was influenced by this. But so you can see this is what Jesus is. The milieu that he is coming into. So things that he would have been aware of. Um, and I'll just say this one last thing is the references to Gehenna. He says, unfortunate gets translated as hell, but it was confused for a long time by scholars as a trash dump. But actually, what it was this place that was associated with child sacrifice, and the Hebrews having sacrificed their children against their own law just to try to get something from God. And you can kind of see this in the ancient Near East. So like I guess Mediterranean. I always think there's two examples I always think of this. You can see where it's just portrayed as a very ill-advised thing. So in the Iliad, it's Agamemnon sacrifices Iphigenia in order to get a good wind so that they can go to Troy and fight. And when he gets back in I think it's in the Iliad, or maybe it's in the Odyssey by that time. When he gets back to his homeland, his wife murders him because he murdered Iphigenia. So it's like pretty clear like that it was done. but like the way it was viewed in the society was kind of like by impulsive people, and as if to I don't know, prove it in it's Jephthah, and who makes the impulsive promise that if God gives him victory over his enemies. This is in Judges, that
Yeah.
he'll offer her, he'll slaughter the first thing
Yeah.
that greets him on his way back or whatever, and it happens to be his daughter. And a lot of judges are portrayed a bit buffoonishly, but he certainly is an idiot for that, and that's and it's like considered like this great tragedy. So Gehenna was a place that was just considered evil, defiled, because it had been a site of sacrifice. And so it's not hell, though. But there is this idea. So I guess in this Abraham, in this Testament of Abraham, he's asked point blank, like, so why do we have this defiled place, within where we can see it from Jerusalem or whatever? And he says, like, so we can so like when we're vindicated, we can see all of our enemies, tortured in Gehenna. And this is not referring though to hell, even though it gets translated as hell a whole
But
bunch.
it is interesting. I think when Jesus was talking about Gehenna, he was addressing the religious leaders of his day, which no wonder why they got mad at Jesus. I mean, he was basically saying, "You're kind of the enemy. Like you're kind of the enemy of God. Your teaching is not of God, essentially." And that has to, yeah. Jesus talks smack, I guess you can say. I mean,
Yeah.
just the idea, like he would always, he seemed like he was always um, made it a point to uplift the marginalized and condemn the highly established, corrupt religious systems of his day. And so for him to, address this is Gehenna, and like kind of like this is where you're going. This is like you're
Hmm.
forsaken by God
Hmm.
in a sense.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
Exactly.
that's
Uh,
pretty powerful.
And
Um,
interesting to note too that, again, I mean, I'm beating a dead horse here, but it's not the four. It's not. He's not preaching the four laws. He's preaching what's going to get you there is the way you treat the poor,
yeah,
and yeah, and the way you use the law to not help the poor, and not
right.
be
And
with.
even like with Abraham's bosom and Lazarus and the rich man, it wasn't like, okay, you get to heaven this way, go to hell this way. He's just like warning the rich. You need to be treating the poor. You need to love them and help them and value them. And that's a strong warning that he had. And not to mention Matthew 25, as you did to the least of these, you did to me. Um, and so, yeah, he just
Yeah,
seems like,
and it's important to mention for the biblical literalists that, like, I don't think when he was saying that stuff, he was trying to formulate a literal, like,
right,
objective, this is the deal or whatever. I mean, clearly the Lazarus and the rich man was a parable, obviously.
right,
I mean, to
right.
people, I mean, so it's not supposed to be something you can get really like, this is what's happening, objectively speaking, this is the correct theology out of it.
Yeah,
So, like,
yeah,
so much of that stuff.
yeah, yeah. It's not, like you said, it's not what, transactional. Yeah. Um,
So trying to like game it, like, and figure out like, okay, how do I play this game of life correctly? It's like, no, it's just to demonstrate that you need to, like, check your heart and be loving. Like, that's how you enter the kingdom now, which is very much related to this idea that we were talking about a little bit before. Like, so he makes these what seem to be inaccurate predictions about the coming of himself in glory or whatever, um, and this reestablishment of the temple and Israel and all this other kind of stuff. But there's this sort of like metaphorizing of what that means. So in two ways. One, it comes to mean like a kingdom now that's within, perhaps. And in another sense, it means there's this what's called already but not yet theology. So the kingdom is already in you. You've received the Holy Spirit, the gifts of the Holy Spirit. If you're, and then the fruits of that are love. And and there will be justice, and that is a kind of justice, but there will be, like, this earth will be just again at some
Yeah.
point. There is a redemption of earth, which I think is a point you were making before about
Mhm.
Jesus wasn't preaching about somewhere else so often. He was preaching about right here. So that,
Right.
like,
Uh,
this there's
I
going to
think
be
of
redemption here.
the concept. I know Ehrman doesn't mention this. The concept of shalom, meaning not just peace, like no conflict, but also mean in a sense of wholeness in our
Made
society
whole.
where
Yeah.
everyone is able to thrive, in a society. And and I guess I kind of translate that into meaning that's what the kingdom of God, that's what we should be pursuing as followers of Christ, is trying to spread shalom to our neighbors. Um,
So
yeah,
it's
and
already happened, but not yet in some
right,
ways.
not
Yeah.
yet, not like we'll
Yeah.
make it perfect, but in our own lives, you know, to
We approach it.
have, I
We
think,
try to
a
approach it.
meaningful and joyful, yeah, having a meaningful and joyful life. I think for me, it includes helping others. It makes you feel good. It makes you
Mm.
feel, I don't know. I mean, I guess that's a little, let's say word is selfish, but in a sense of,
Well,
when
it depends what you consider
you're doing,
yourself. We're in this
yeah,
together. That's part of the
yeah,
point. Is like, I have
right,
I have to have an expanded sense of self that includes. So, like, you were talking about before in one of the other episodes about most versions of, well, like resurrection, for example, bodily resurrection, like as in Ezekiel, was about the people, the
right.
Israel together. So, like, will be made whole again, reestablished. So, like, Jesus is
Oh,
encouraging us, it seems, right, to we include, in our group, not just our friends, but our enemies, and not just ourselves, but the
yeah.
other.
That's one thing at the Mennonite church I went to this morning. We had communion, and they made it a point that this is an open table. Anyone that
Beautiful, yeah.
is thirsting for God can come. Like they really made it a point, and and everyone was coming. Like it was kind of a sort of a disorganized kind of thing that when
I
people were
have
coming
nobody
up,
lined up, right?
it was
Gotcha.
kind of cool. It wasn't like the good Catholics that they. I remember being trained to when to stand up and
Yeah,
you
right.
know, um, but it was kind of cool. Kids were taking it, and just like it was just an open table, and they really made it a point. They wrote it in the bulletin. This is an open communion table. This is open communion. They made it, and they emphasized that before. Um, so in a sense, I guess that's what you were saying. Just just as Ezekiel, like having a resurrection of a people.
Yeah,
And
all of
how
us.
yeah. So like if when I do good works, it's just not just me, but it's
Not
part of
individual
part of the
salvation. Yeah.
community. Yeah, yeah, making the world a better place. Um, and we talked about before about the fruit of eternal conscious torment, and it's just like, would you? And we talked about this in our last episode. Would you become a follower of Christ? Would you go to church? And
Hmm, hmm.
if you knew this was all there is, And I think a lot. I've asked the question a lot, and a lot of people, not that they're trying to earn their salvation, but like that's kind of why they're Christians because they've been given like immunity. Basically, they're gonna go
Certain
into heaven.
promises have been made. Yes.
Yeah, certain promises is made, but like you miss. Well, here's from another book. I took this. I marked this in this one book. A spirituality of hell will never center on the lessons we learn from the life of Jesus. It will obsessively fixate on his death as a ticket out of hell. And I can see that in my life. Just I was just totally consumed about one making sure that I'm showing the fruit of a person that's genuinely received Christ and the Holy Spirit. And I would worry about that. Like, am I really showing this fruit? Did I really believe? And two, I was obsessively fixated on just getting people in my life saved, saying the prayer and presenting the gospel. And then I just missed all the lessons that Jesus taught during his life. The Sermon on the Mount or the Sermon on the Plain, and loving your enemy, the Good Samaritan. Um, as you did to the least of these, you did to me, and just all of his teaching. It seems like just I I missed it because I was so fixated on just the black and white. Did you say the prayer and show fruit, or did you say not say the prayer, or you did not show fruit? Like I was just that was a fixation for me, and I think that's bad fruit. That's bad theology. I think when you have that mindset.
Oh, if to back to the beginning, I mean, for me, it creates a certain scrupulosity, and that's not what God wants. God wants a freedom, a loving freedom. And it's funny that you talked about, like worrying that if you were showing the fruits of your redemption or the fruits of your salvation, that was like something that Calvin had to face a lot because he had people who like went along with him,
Yeah,
but like were always writing to him, asking him like, oh, like how do we know that we're saved then? Whatever. If like there's to be no, kind of like transacting this, or whatever. And there's answers that he came up with and stuff like that. I don't think any of them are adequate because um, once you introduce a dynamic, I'm not saying that he introduced it wholeheartedly himself. There is some elements in Paul that we'll get to, I think probably next, but he just was like, um, look, yeah, you're going to see these fruits or whatever, but like, then people wind up becoming obsessed, and it doesn't alleviate any worry, because all the thing around baptism too, all the different ins and outs of, like, well, I've received my baptism, I've done the four things or whatever, but I still sin, all that kind of stuff produces all kinds of anxiety, still bad thoughts. And then you have to pastorally figure out how to get in with that. Like,
yeah.
all
They would
that.
like a passage that I would come across a lot was like, not everyone who says Lord, Lord, Lord will enter the kingdom of heaven. And that was just like you said, the anxiety of that. Like, wow, I said the prayer, you know, but am I really entering the kingdom of heaven? Because not
Oh,
everyone that says Lord,
yeah,
Lord, not everyone that has said the sinner's prayer will enter the kingdom of heaven.
that's right. Well,
Can
Calvin
cause
was
a
like
lot of
saying like, well, yeah, tons of anxiety. And like, Calvin, I mean, he professed to not have any anxiety, to be totally certain about his salvation. But like, you know, the people that were writing to him were saying like, how do you know? It was like more complicated than like, just because you're showing good works or the fruits or whatever, what if you're not really saved, but you're like doing that to like try to prove to yourself that you're saved? It just
right.
turns into all kinds of mind games
Yeah.
that as long as you have, I just don't think there's any way around it. As long as you have hell and eternal conscious torment and all this crap, you're going to have this anxiety about it. And I mean, maybe you just are anyways, because like as much work as I've done on it, with myself, it still pops in my mind, like that I'm damned or whatever, because like, oh, I've done, because I reject the eternal conscious doctrine, or because I don't, go to Catholic Church anymore and receive at the communion table or whatever. All, like all that, like that person in me that's still, is affected by those things. And I don't really believe like, oh, well, if we just raised our kids without any of that, then they wouldn't have any anxiety about that kind of thing. Maybe, I don't know. Like, do people raised atheists and live as atheists, do they have no thoughts about the afterlife for real? I mean, I don't know. So I'm not saying that it's by itself responsible for every bit of anxiety that anybody's ever had about the afterlife. Because as Ehrman points out in the beginning of the book, people were concerned about the afterlife long before the idea of eternal conscious
Yeah.
torment. They just didn't know what it was. It was facing the unknown or
Yeah.
whatever. But I will say that like it has contributed to a lot of anxiety and to a
Yeah.
lot of suffering. and to a lot of like I mean, there are a lot of people that will say, well, if you're a transactional mercenary, at least you're doing the good things anyways. I just don't think it works out though, because I just think like if you are doing good things, I mean, I think you always are partially out of fear, but like if you never get to experience yourself doing something good because it's just good and not because of any guarantee that you have. I mean, it's clear that when Christ was on the cross and saying, my God, why have you forsaken me? That's a very human moment of like, I don't see how this is working out. The deal doesn't seem to be
Yeah.
going right. So even if he did say I'm going to even if he did predict that he was going to be raised in 3 days and all the rest of that stuff, as is testified in the gospels, especially John on the cross, whatever he said in terms of like, I'm going to be raised in 3 days, that was gone. What was
He had
there
some.
was just radical doubts, fear.
That's right. Yeah, he had some doubts.
Yeah, absolutely.
He was deconstructing.
It's a pretty lightning method of deconstruction there for
I love that.
sure.
Well, yeah. I mean, like you said, like it was. He had some doubts on the cross. He had some doubts in the garden when he was sweating blood, and
Asking to
so yeah,
take the cup from him, he didn't want it, and
yeah, yeah,
so maybe like how we ended today, because I think for sure we need to talk about John of Patmos and Revelation because that's like affected so many people. But I'll just because I think next time it'll just be Paul and then John of Patmos and maybe some of the other extra biblical stuff. But James Tabor makes the point that by the time the Gospels were written, probably a lot of the Gospel writers were somewhat aware of Paul's theology. So Tabor tries to uh, figure out like what the Ebionites taught. So that would be, after Jesus died, that would be James, brother of Jesus, speaking of Jesus's family, and that would be, the brothers in Jerusalem. So Peter, they're not mentioned, but it would be Mary Magdalene, and it would be Mary, and yeah, I guess those kind of folks, let's just say. Uh, and so that they would have had one message that was maybe from having actual contact with Jesus. Not saying it wasn't like altered or whatever, but Paul says that he was taught directly by Jesus. And this is where this whole substitutionary atonement theology gets developed. And in as much as it appears in the Gospels, somebody like James Tabor would say that wasn't from Jesus, that was from the Gospel writers being aware of Paul's working of this. And so Paul would say, I did not, I'm not saying that's right. I'm just saying that that's, what
yeah,
somebody like him would say in order to do, this kind of figuring out what Jesus taught and what Peter and James and Mary and the two Marys were teaching, and what Paul was doing, and because a lot of Paul got read back into the early gospel writers, because Paul wrote earlier than any of the gospels. So we can just assume that perhaps if they didn't actually have one of Paul's letters when they were sitting down to write the gospels, if they just had Q, and Q is disputed now, but like, or they just had oral accounts or whatever they had, uh, at least orally they would have been somewhat aware of Paul's idea, which I really want to explore next time, because I don't think it started off necessarily as this. Um, I don't know. I don't think it translates directly into the four spiritual laws or whatever. Is all I'm saying. But you can see that Paul had a special thing that James and Peter did not, which was Paul was trying to make this message so that it could be brought to the Gentiles. And
yeah,
so, whereas it's clear the Ebionites back in Jerusalem were, basically Jewish uh, followers of Christ, and so they, were still teaching, and certain Jewish traditions and laws had to be followed. Paul was preaching something that was apparently pretty pissy to James, which was that you don't need to do any of this Jewish stuff. You don't need to be
Right.
circumcised. You don't need to like keep kosher or whatever. You're free. And Paul's got some really interesting stuff to work out because
And
he's like,
he had a different audience, I suppose.
exactly. And so you can see
So
why he would want to base it more less on like traditional Jewish practice and more on something like belief. But like,
yeah, yeah.
so he was trying to figure it out. Now,
If you don't have
so
access, it was 70 AD, right, when the temple was destroyed.
mhm,
So if you don't have access to the temple, then what are you going to become? Like as far as where's your identity? And maybe Christianity became more of a belief system, and Judaism became more of a people of the book
right.
kind
Well,
of
very
belief.
famously, that's true because
Yeah,
once the temple was destroyed, the Pharisaic Judaism is what modern Judaism is. It's not centered on a temple, so it's not Sadducees,
no,
and it's
you're
not
right.
centered on end times, so they're not Essenes. They are Pharisaic in the sense that that moves to the synagogue away from the
Right.
temple, and a synagogue is not a place for sacrifice like animals and crap like that. It's a place for reading the Torah together and gathering
I
together.
suppose that movement exploded when the temple was destroyed.
That's right.
It
It's
all
fascinating that Paul, is writing before, and the Gospels are not, but Paul
yeah,
is writing before the destruction of the temple,
yeah,
and his arguments, with Peter and James in Jerusalem, are happening before the destruction of the temple, and so like you know, you might wonder if. In what way that plays into the way their argument was, and then the argument's going to be different once the gospel writers come along. Mark was seems to be have written just before the temple destruction, perhaps, and
mhm,
then all the rest of the gospels are written afterwards, and so they would have been aware to some degree of. And especially you see in Luke, like when he starts off his gospel, I'm writing to you, Theophilus, so that you can see that we're cool people or whatever, basically. So like he's got a concern to like try to make all the little like disagreements within the movement, the way whatever it was called at that point, trying to
yeah,
smooth it over so that, like it's no wonder that like the main star of Acts is Paul, but like none of his letters agree with the Paul in Acts. They're
right,
just like these totally different person almost. Like they don't go to the same places. They don't like not in the same or nothing, So it's just like whoever is writing Luke is writing Paul like as they received Paul from a tradition because they're writing at least 20 years after Paul.
yeah,
So they never met him, probably they're just learning about him, uh,
right,
or whatever, from other people. Who knows what sources they had, and they don't know Peter or James at that point. They knew none of the original disciples. Ehrman makes a point to say that it's two generations at that point afterwards, before anybody's before the Gospels are written, and so they're and Paul like never claimed to see Jesus in the flesh, and Paul even says some crazy things that we're definitely going to talk about next time that really were a scandal to a lot of people, like flesh and blood shall not inherit the kingdom. What
right,
theology does that guy got going on? Like
yeah,
pretty hard. He's not talking about the resurrection.
right,
Clearly, I mean, there's this crazy distinction between bodies, like the sark body, the versus the corporeal body or whatever, or the soma body. Sorry, but like yeah, so like that'll have to be next time though. So, anyways, any last thoughts, Kevin, or
no, no, I think
no?
we got, I guess we discussed basically one chapter, I think, right?
Yeah. Well, no, it's.
So
I mean, it wasn't the all like the milieu of the time, like the Maccabees and the Abraham and that stuff.
seven.
That okay, and then we didn't do the New Testament yet, really.
That was, let me see what was the chapter. Um, that was, that kind of got into the New Testament. Chapter 8 is
Yeah,
Jesus in the afterlife. Um,
right.
we spoke on a little bit of that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, I also thought, I know we're running a little late. Like, I guess we could talk about it next week, but just the idea of like having forces of evil and the devil and demons and things like that, and just
Oh, it's good. Yeah, you're not. Yeah, I did that. That is New Testament stuff for sure. Yeah,
yeah,
you're
it
right.
seems like it was kind of something that was created to like combat like why is there evil in the world, and I think he did, and so not to blame it on God, right? Just blame on evil forces. But I remember, I think in his, I think I don't know if I read it somewhere else, but he said like polytheism doesn't have to deal with how could God let this happen, because you could always blame it on another God.
Yeah, no, he
That
wrote
evil.
that. This is Ehrman. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's just interesting that was being a monotheistic or what's the other term? Monotheistic,
Henotheism, I think.
henotheistic.
Yeah,
Uh, is kind of like, why is there evil in the world? And I feel like just that's something that the writers of the Bible is always trying to grapple with. Why is
oh,
there
for sure.
suffering?
Yeah,
And then just I feel like almost like the devil and its demons and evil forces were just kind of created to like address this is why there's
for
suffering. This
sure.
is why there's evil in the world. Anyway, we can talk about that next week. But
I think it'll bring
um,
us deeper too into a really important thing, which is the mapping of Greek culture
yeah,
onto after Alexander conquered the ancient Near East, like what that did to the religion of the Levant, the southern Levant, and like just like especially notions of God that are not, you would say, I guess, native to Canaan or to Palestine area or whatever.
mm,
Like, so like omniscient, omnibenevolent, all that kind of stuff. You can see how it got mapped on, but it wasn't quite as philosophically worked out
yeah,
that the God of Israel was all the omnis, omnipresent,
right, right,
omnipotent, omnibenevolent, and then all of a sudden forget the last one, but omniscient, all knowing. So yeah, so like those are all that's Greek terminology that gets
yeah,
mapped onto God. So yeah, that I mean that makes a lot of sense. And then just the place of the demonic, of the satanic. Those are, for me at least, a little bit distinct in the Levant at this time, or in Jesus's time, at any rate, requires a little bit of discussion of Greek culture and how that affected the belief there. So, yeah.
right.